The general store locked its door at 4 o'clock, and Delia watched the proprietor flip the sign without once looking at her through the glass. She stood in the frozen mud of Caldwell's Crossing, Montana, with 8 cents in her coat pocket and a carpet bag containing everything she had left in the world. A spare shirtwaist, a Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins, and a tin photograph of a man she had burned the better part of her life trying to please. She didn't burn it. She should have. She brought it anyway. The cold here was different from Denver cold. Denver cold was rude. This cold was indifferent, which was worse. It moved through her wool coat like the fabric wasn't there, settled into the hollow of her chest, and got comfortable. 2 days on the stage. 1 day in this town that wasn't really a town yet, just a cluster of ambitions that hadn't decided whether to live or die. The rooming house had turned her away that morning. No vacancy, the woman behind the door had said, though the parking lot held exactly 2 horses and a mule. She had looked at Delia's frayed cuffs and arrived at her decision in under 3 seconds. The livery was the only building still showing a light. Delia picked up the carpet bag and walked toward it. The man inside the livery wasn't the liveryman. She figured that out in about 4 seconds. He moved through the space with the ease of someone navigating his own kitchen, not a public establishment. He was enormous, not the soft enormous of a man who ate well, the other kind. Shoulders that looked like they'd been assembled out of fence posts, hands so scarred and thick they barely looked like hands. He wore canvas work pants and a heavy wool vest over a faded union suit, and he was rubbing down a black horse with the focused attention of a man who considered this the most important thing happening in the world. He hadn't looked up when she came in. Delia stood just inside the doorway, the wind pushing at her back. The livery smelled of hay and horse sweat and manure, and it was the most welcome smell she had encountered since leaving Denver, because it meant warmth, animal warmth, the kind that didn't require payment. She cleared her throat. The man kept rubbing down the horse. "Livery's closed," he said. His voice came from somewhere deep in his chest, like sound traveling up through rock. "The liveryman told me I could shelter here until the morning stage." That was a lie. She hadn't spoken to the liveryman. He had closed up and vanished an hour ago. The man's hand slowed on the horse's flank. He turned his head, not fully, just enough to see her in his peripheral. His face was covered in a thick dark beard, shot through with grey, and his eyes, when they briefly registered her, were pale brown. Not warm brown. Brown like creek water before a flood. Liverymen say that. It wasn't a question. Delia said nothing. The man went back to rubbing down the horse. "Stage doesn't run tomorrow," he said. "Pass is closing. Storm coming in by midnight." Delia had suspected as much. The clouds over the peaks to the north had the particular grey-green color of incoming violence. She set her carpet bag down on the straw-covered ground and sat on a hay bale just inside the door. She folded her hands in her lap, tucked her chin down against the wind, and prepared to wait him out. She had discovered over the last 7 months that she was surprisingly good at waiting things out. The man finished with the horse. He led it into a stall, secured the latch, and gathered his tools without once acknowledging her presence. Then he picked up his coat from a hook on the wall, his saddlebags from a beam, and walked toward the door. He stopped 2 feet from her. She looked up at him. He looked down at her with those floodwater eyes, and said nothing for long enough that the silence had weight. "You eat today," he finally said. Delia's jaw tightened. "I'm fine." He looked at her carpet bag. He looked at her fraying cuffs. He looked at the way she was gripping her own hands to stop them shaking, and not from cold. "Come eat supper," he said. It came out the same way. He'd probably say, "Nail wants pulling," or "Fence needs mending," a task he'd identified and intended to complete. He walked out into the dark. After a moment, Delia picked up her carpet bag and followed him. His name was Corbett. She found that out when he said it at the door of his cabin, the way a man states a fact. Not offering it, just placing it on the table so she'd have it. The cabin sat a quarter-mile up a fire road from the town's edge, set back in the pines so completely that she wouldn't have found it without him. From the outside, it looked like the mountain had grown a roof. Inside, it was one room, a stone hearth on the north wall, a cast-iron cookstove, a heavy oak table with 2 chairs that didn't match, shelves of preserved goods, tools hanging from the low rafters, a narrow cot against the east wall under a window, the pane so old the glass had gone wavy. He had a horse, stabled in a small shed attached to the back of the cabin. She heard it moving as he came inside. She heard him go back out 2 minutes later to check on it, and come back in carrying a few pieces of firewood. He stoked the stove. He didn't ask her to sit. She sat anyway at the table, because her legs had stopped being reliable sometime around noon. He cooked without speaking. Fried salt pork and onions, canned tomatoes heated in a small pot, cornbread made from a tin of mix, pressed flat in the skillet. Nothing complicated, nothing that required more than 10 minutes and 2 pots. He put a plate in front of her and sat across the table with his own. Delia ate slowly at first. Carefully, the way she'd been trained to eat. Small bites, fork tines down, back straight. She got through 4 bites at proper pace, and then something in her chest gave out, and she ate the way she'd been eating alone in hotel rooms and stage depots for the past 7 months. Efficiently, gratefully, without ceremony. When she wiped the last of the tomato juice from her plate with the cornbread and ate that too, she put her fork down and didn't look at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" he said. "I was hungry." He looked at her with those pale eyes. "I know you were," he said. "That's why I made supper." The storm came in before midnight, like he said it would. It didn't announce itself. 1 minute the wind was moving through the pines, the next it was tearing through them, and then the snow started in earnest. Not flurries, but the thick, wet, horizontal kind that reduced visibility to the end of your own arm. The cabin shuddered. The fire, behind the grate, roared when the wind found the chimney, then settled. Corbett had given her the cot, pulling extra blankets from the cedar chest at its foot and dropping them without comment. He'd taken the floor near the stove, bedding down on a folded, canvas tarp with the efficiency of a man who'd slept in worse places and saw no reason to discuss it. Delia lay on the cot, staring at the dark ceiling and listening to the storm dismantle the world outside, and thought, not for the first time, that she was entirely at the mercy of a man she did not know. She thought about Renner, who had beautiful hands, fine-boned, clean-nailed, the kind of hands that gestured elegantly when he spoke in drawing rooms. The same hands that had thrown a cut crystal decanter at her head 10 months ago because she'd asked, very quietly, why the household accounts were short by $400. She'd moved in time. The decanter had hit the doorframe and exploded into 1,000 catching pieces that she'd swept up herself, alone, while he sat in the next room and refreshed his drink. She'd left with almost nothing. What she had left, she'd lost to a woman on a stage who'd lifted her purse with an artist's touch and a peppermint stick as distraction. She hadn't cried then, she didn't now. What she felt, listening to the wind tear at the eaves, and the man across the room breathe in the deep, even cadence of sleep, was something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Nothing was going to happen to her tonight, not because of anything she'd done or earned, just because a man with floodwater eyes had seen her sitting in the dark and decided that supper was the appropriate response to the situation. Morning was grey and merciless. The snow had piled against the door to the height of her knee. Corbett was already up when she woke, shrugging into his coat in the cold half-dark, before the stove had built back to warmth. He saw her watching him from the cot. "Horse needs checking," he said. "Coffee's on." He went out through the back door into the shed, and she heard him moving in there. Low voice, hoofbeats, shifting on the packed earth floor, the sound of hay dropping. He was talking to the horse. She couldn't make out words, just tone. The easy, unhurried tone of a man who said more to animals than to people. She got up, found the battered enamel coffee pot on the stove's warming plate, and poured herself a cup. Her body was stiff in ways she hadn't felt since. Well, since before she'd had soft mattresses and Renner's money, which meant since before she'd made the best and worst decision of her adult life in the same afternoon. She found a rag, picked up the skillet from last night. Carefully, after checking the temperature with the back of her wrist first, a habit her mother had drilled into her before she'd been old enough to reach the stove, she scraped it clean and set it back on the hook. She was washing the tin plates in the basin when Corbett came back in. He stopped inside the door, looked at the clean skillet on its hook, and said nothing. He just went to the stove and poured his own coffee and sat in the chair by the hearth to drink it. "How long will the pass be closed?" Delia asked. Corbett looked at the window. The glass was solid white with packed snow. 3 days. Could be 5. 5 days. "I'll stay out of your way," she said. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that might have been the beginning of a wry expression, crushed quickly. "You made coffee and washed the plates," he said. "You can stay in the way." He didn't ask about her. For 2 days, he simply didn't ask. He went about his business, maintaining the fire, feeding the horse, clearing snow from the doorway, mending a cracked piece of harness with an awl and waxed thread, and he let her exist in the same space, without requiring an explanation for her existence. Nobody had done that in a long time. It made her more nervous than questions would have, questions she knew how to deflect. Silence she had to fill herself, and she found, sitting across the hearth from a man who was clearly not going to fill it for her, that what she wanted to fill it with surprised her. "Where did you come from?" she asked him on the second evening. "Originally," he looked up from the harness. "Tennessee," he said. "Long way. Seems shorter every year." He pulled the thread through. "You?" "Ohio. Originally. Denver, most recently." He didn't ask why she'd left Denver. He went back to the harness. After a moment she said, "My husband had money and a temper, and a lot of associates in Denver who would have taken his word over mine in any courtroom in the state." The awl stopped. She was staring at the fire. She hadn't planned to say it. It had just arrived, the way things did when you'd held them too long. "So I left," she said. "I had a little money I'd set aside over 2 years. I got on a stage heading north. I didn't particularly care where it stopped, as long as he didn't know the name of the town." Corbett set the harness down across his knees. He looked at his scarred hands for a moment. "Man who uses a woman's fear to keep her still," he said, his voice very quiet, "isn't using it to keep her. He's using it because it's the only power he's got." Delia looked at him. He picked the harness back up. He didn't look at her. "You're safe here," he said. "Storm or no storm, pass is iced over till April. Nobody comes up that road in April unless they know the way, and most people who know the way are people I know." He pulled the thread through the stitch. "You can stop watching the door." Delia realized she had been watching the door. She turned back to the fire. She thought about the night Renner had found out she'd been setting aside money. How he'd stood in the doorway of the bedroom with that very particular stillness that meant the drinking had crossed a line. How she'd stood with her back to the wall and kept her voice steady and told herself, "This is the last time. This is the last time I let this be a thing that happens to me." She'd told herself that 3 times before. She reached up, her fingers grazing the side of her jaw where the bruise had long since faded, but her memory of it hadn't. Corbett was watching her hand. She dropped it. He didn't say anything. He went back to the harness. Later that night, after she'd moved to the cot and he'd settled on the floor, she heard him get up once, quietly, and check the bolt on the door. Not because he'd heard anything, just to check. She pretended to be asleep. The fever came on the 3rd morning. She woke up wrong, the cabin tilting slightly, her joints aching in the deep mineral way that meant something had gotten into the blood and taken up residence. She sat up and the room swam. She put her feet on the cold floor and waited for her head to settle. It didn't. She made it to the table before her legs gave out. She sat down hard in the chair and pressed her palms flat on the wood and breathed. Corbett came in from the shed and stopped. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead the way she'd seen mothers do, not soft, just deliberate, his rough skin cool against her burning face. "Fever," he said. "I know," she said. "I don't need bed," he said again. Same tone, same volume, somehow more absolute the second time. He helped her up without making it feel like helping, just moved alongside her, a steadying presence, until she was lying down on the cot, with the heavy quilt pulled up. He brought the willow bark he kept in a sealed jar on the high shelf. She watched him shake the dried strips into a cup, pour water from the kettle over it, let it steep to something the color of strong tea. It tasted like the inside of a tree. She drank all of it. She slept hard and badly. At some point in the dark, she was back in the Denver house, in the hallway with the wallpaper she'd picked out herself. The morning light, coming through the east window at a specific angle she still saw sometimes in dreams. Rena's voice from somewhere behind her, very calm, the way it got when the anger had moved past heat into something colder and more considered. She woke with a gasp and someone's hand on her arm, not restraining, just present, just there. Corbett was sitting on the wooden crate next to the cot. He had a bowl of cold water and a cloth. He pressed the cloth to her forehead and she let out a breath, and the dream went back wherever it came from. She turned her head slightly and saw, in the low orange light of the stove, that his other hand was resting on his knee near the short-barreled rifle he kept by the door, not gripping it, just near it, just in case something needed addressing. Nothing needed addressing. It was a dream. But he stayed there anyway. She didn't ask him to. She didn't have to. The pass opened on the 4th day. The sun came out with the particular viciousness of high-altitude sun on fresh snow. Blinding, immediate, turning the whole world into a single white glare. The temperature dropped another 15 degrees. But the wind died, and by noon Corbett could move through the yard without fighting the weather for every step. Delia felt the shift. She was stronger, fever-weak, the kind of tiredness that lives in the muscles rather than the mind, but stronger. She was up and dressed when he came in from clearing the path to the shed. She watched him knock the snow from his boots at the door. Something had shifted in her chest over the last 4 days. She'd felt it happening, and not examined it too closely, because she'd learned that examining shifts like that too early was like picking at a lock that might open fine on its own. But standing here in his cabin in his shirt, he'd given her a second one for the fever sweats, a dark blue flannel, which now felt more like hers than his. She thought she should probably say something. "Stage'll be through Caldwell's Crossing in 2 days, Corbett said. He was hanging his coat. He didn't look at her. "Road's passable from here. Old Bert at the general store will let you wait there. I'll bring you down tomorrow morning," Delia said. "All right." She said it to his back. She watched his shoulders. He turned around. She looked at him. The beard shot through with grey, the pale eyes, the hands that had carried her firewood and made her cornbread, and pressed a cold cloth to her forehead at 2 in the morning because she was burning up in someone else's nightmare. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I want to be clear about that. You don't owe me a stage ticket or a recommendation, or even the morning it takes to walk me down the road." Corbett looked at her steadily. "I know that," he said. "I'm saying it because men in my experience prefer the arithmetic of it. The ledger. What's owed? I'm not those men." "No," she said. "I can see that." The fire in the stove popped. Outside, a clump of snow dropped from a pine bough and hit the ground with a soft thud. Corbett looked at the window. Then he looked back at her. He shifted his weight on his boots the way a man does when he's working up to something and isn't practiced at it. "It's quiet here," he said. "I noticed. I like the quiet." He paused. "I've been up this mountain a long time and I don't generally want company." Another pause, longer. "I don't generally mind yours." The air in the room went very still. Delia looked at him. She thought about the stage. She thought about wherever the stage was going. The next town, some other county seat, another rooming house with a woman at the door who looked at her fraying cuffs and made her decision in 3 seconds. She thought about starting over again from a different starting line that looked exactly like this one. Then she looked at the cast-iron skillet on its hook, the 2 mismatched chairs at the table, the jar of willow bark on the high shelf. She looked at Corbett. "This isn't pity," she said carefully. "It wasn't a question." "No," he said. "And it isn't." She searched for the word. "Charity." His expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, the closest he seemed to get to one. "I've been alone on this mountain long enough," he said, "that having someone wash the skillet feels like the best thing that happened to me in 2 years. That's not charity, that's just honest." Delia felt something unknot very slowly in her chest, something she'd tied tight so many times it had calcified. She walked to the stove. She picked up the iron poker and stirred the coals without being asked. Sparks flew and settled. The heat came up in a wave. "I don't know how to set a trap," she said. "I can't skin anything. I'll probably drop that skillet again." "I'll show you the traps," Corbett said. "Skinning takes practice. And I've dropped that skillet too. You have not." "I have. Once." He went to the coat peg. He hung his hat up. He glanced back at her with something easy in his eyes, something she suspected he didn't show very often. Just the once. Delia took the wooden spoon from the hook beside the stove and opened the pot of beans he'd started that morning. She stirred them. The smell rose up, warm, plain, and completely specific to this cabin, this altitude, this latitude of her life that she hadn't expected to find. "Then I suppose we're even," she said. Corbett pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, and they didn't say anything else for a while, and it was the quietest and the most comfortable Delia had been in years, and neither of them needed to remark on that at all. Outside, the last of the storm clouds were moving east, dragging their shadows off the mountain. The road below wound down through the pines toward Caldwell's Crossing, passable now, clear and cold, and going somewhere. She didn't take it.